Welcome to the Financial Planning for Canadian Business Owners podcast. You will hear about industry insights with award-winning financial planner and entrepreneur Jason Pereira. Through the interviews with different experts with their stories and advice, you will learn how you can navigate the challenges of being an entrepreneur, plan for success, and make the most of your business and life. And now, your host, Jason Pereira.
Well, welcome. Today on the show, I have Ashley Murphy, founder of the Global Financial Planning Institute. Ashley is a well-known cross-border planner specializing in U.S.-Australian cross-border, but has also expanded more recently into helping educate advisors and people about the challenges of planning across borders. And with that, here's my interview with Ashley. Ashley, thanks for taking the time today.
Absolutely. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you, Jason.
Yes, and we have quite the contrast going on right now because you are in surfer's paradise with just basically the most beautiful weather imaginable. And I am in the middle of a Toronto snowstorm, which for those of you listening in the States, it does not happen every day. It's not always snowing. So let's move on. So Ashley, tell us about a little bit what it is you do.
Absolutely. So really two things here, but let me focus on the Global Financial Planning Institute. So I am the founder of the Global Financial Planning Institute. It's an organization founded to provide community education, resources, and ongoing support for financial advisors and other financial professionals working across borders. I'm also an advisor, have been for a little over a decade actually, where I work with Australian American expats, so Aussies in the US and Americans in Australia.
Excellent. So you carved yourself out a niche years ago. You also, I've even heard you, we know each other for a couple of years now. You were on the XYPN radio podcast talking about that niche in particular. So I'll try to link to that. So anyone who wants to learn more about your practice can learn there. But in particular, I brought you on the show to talk about the challenges of basically handling planning across borders. And this is something that I don't think the average person has any idea of just how convoluted it can get. They seem, like I say, I almost get frustrated when I see people treat borders as if they're just imaginary lines. There's massive repercussions. So talk to me a little bit about why you got into this space and how you help people in that scenario. Tell me a little bit about how you got into this space and how you help people in that scenario.
Okay, absolutely. Well, I first feel prompted to respond to what you said there, and that is, I think you and I, Jason, have a strong feeling and mission towards educating the advisory community that this is not merely some small belt-mounted toolkit of practices or issues that one can simply apply when dealing with an international cross-border client. It's a whole different specialty altogether. And so you and I, no doubt, both keep a close ear to the ground for articles that we see out there. And I was drawn to an article just earlier this week in wealthmanagement.com, and it was talking about, here are the things you need to know about international and cross-border planning. And it dealt with two issues. Two very superficial issues. And it just reminds me that there's rarely even the airspace, the airtime given to thinking about these issues and what it all might encompass. But anyway, that all being said, how did I get into this? Really this situation I was born into it, to be honest. So I'm a tri-citizen. I was born in the UK, raised in Australia to an American mother. And so I moved to the US.
Way to complicate your life from birth. Okay, keep going.
How it happened, man. That's how it happened. So these issues have always been with me. When I moved to the US, I just figured that I'm certainly not one of a kind. There's thousands, perhaps maybe tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands with triple citizenship, but certainly tens of millions or even hundreds of millions, perhaps, with dual citizenship. So this is a pretty common issue. It's updated research on it to see that there are, in fact, tens of millions of such individuals in the US. So it really is incredibly common. So 2005, moved to the US and thought, well, gosh, there's got to be books, resources. There's got to be somewhere to go to find out about the issues that pertain to these individuals. There wasn't. There was nothing I could find. I didn't, have anything like the resources at my disposal then as I do now. But I think you might have been in the room. I actually remember the very first meeting, Denver, FPA 2010.
I wasn't there for that one. I apologize. After that.
So I remember feeling this is my crowd. This is my crowd. There were folks from all over the world there, and they were purportedly dealing with international and cross-border issues. And I really had my tail between my legs. I was mindful. I was the least experienced person in the room. I'd been in the business by that point for all of 6 months, still studying towards my CFP. So I was an earnest student and trying to figure out what these people knew. But after I would say 5 years participating in this knowledge circle, I realized, and actually having been told, that there were organized programs that the FPSB had instituted for cross-border certification and or initiatives that other planners had underway. Eventually, enough time went by where I figured these programs are not occurring. I did my own research and found out that the mentor of mine, who was well placed to know such things, who had spoken about these FPSB initiatives, was in fact incorrect. And so it's something that led to, it took a tremendously long time to prove that there wasn't anything there. My father-in-law has a great example. He was a cancer doctor, and he gave this example of when they give test results back, they can say, we found no evidence of cancer. That's very different from saying there is no cancer at all.
No cancer. Yeah.
And that's the situation I found myself in, is someone has said there are resources out there. Well, to prove that statement wrong, you've got to look under every rock, turn over every stone, look in every cave, go everywhere to show that that is in fact incorrect. And I think I've done it. And it was that. And I probably came to that realization, I'd say 3 or 4 years ago. And it was at that point where I said, I get it. There are structural forces preventing an initiative from getting off the ground to provide this kind of education. And I'm very pleased to say that that's now, some of those issues have been resolved. So, we have support from the FPA and also from that very mentor that made that comment about the FPSB and the initiatives that they had in place. He's actually now a member of the Financial Planning Institute himself. So it's been interesting. It's been a political sea change, and it's been reassuring.
Excellent. So basically what you're doing is you're spending your time now split between your normal day job, which is being a financial planner, and educating planners on these issues. So let's focus in on these issues and how they come about. I mean, I like to describe it, and I'll start off, and you can edit as you'd like. But I always say that when you're dealing with cross-border issues, especially when someone's a U.S. citizen, you're dealing with 2 different playbooks. And one of them is written in one language, and the other one's written in another language. And there's this little translation piece called the cross-border treaty that doesn't actually address that much. And you're left looking at, hey, this works here, but then you got to verify, has it been addressed? And if not, does it work on the other playbook? And I don't have to tell you about the convoluted nature of the U.S. tax code, but this can be a challenge. So, I mean, that's how I sum it up, is that you're playing by 2 different rule books. And unfortunately, what works here doesn't necessarily work in the other one.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And another dimension to add to that is enforcement. So the U.S. has the most complicated tax code in the world. We all know that. And that's partly based on it, or if not entirely based on it, being a rules-based system, as opposed to in Australia and the UK, perhaps Canada is similar in that regard. I don't know. But in Australia, it's a principles-based system. So I've got an example I'm fond of giving, where a high net worth client who had some stock options moved back to Australia. Lo and behold, there was some law I'd never heard of before called TOFA that was to do with taxing gains on foreign exchange held in bank accounts. And with my US-centric view of looking at tax, I said, hey, we don't have anything to worry about. We're holding this in an investment account. It's not a bank account. And that would be the right interpretation in the US. It's right there in the law. It says this affects bank accounts. Now, when I engaged with counsel in Australia, they said, no. They said, it might say bank accounts, but what they really mean is any other account where you're holding these funds in a cash manner. So to go back to your analogy, yes, absolutely. That's exactly an accurate characterization. It's as if it's written in two different languages. And we've got, to borrow from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, we've got that translating worm that operates between these 2 languages. Babel fish is
Babel fish, yep.
But the Babel fish is only capable of interpreting half of what actually comes through. And so it's a very unusual situation where, and of course, my expertise really pertains just to that Australia-US context, where you can literally shop for the opinion that you want. Outside of those very few areas where there is a settled and agreed upon interpretation, you can actually shop for the opinion that you want. And of course, it's really dependent upon the risk tolerance of the advisor and the client as to what they want to do. But outside of that, outside of settled law, that's the Wild West. That's the situation we operate in. And it's that context that adds another element to the mission that the GFPI Institute has, and that is to see things settled. Because obviously tax treaties weren't written in such a way for the users of the treaty to get superior outcomes to what domestic residents in either country would get. And yet, there are some circumstances where you see, again, of course, it's always going to be Aussies that I refer to, but Aussies that are able to get out of the US and pay no taxes or very, very little taxes on their retirement savings in a completely legitimate manner because of how the tax treaty works and how the Australian tax laws work. And, when they deem Australian tax residency to resume, and they give a step up in basis to the position of the date that the tax residency resumes. So that's another goal, is to see harmony and standardization and equity introduced globally so that markets function and tax systems function for everyone.
Boy, I mean, it's another utterly frustrating avenue sometimes. I mean, it's a great little niche for advisors to cut out because, frankly, the level of complexity is such that it takes a lot of investment and time to actually get good at this stuff. But at the same time, it is fraught with peril for those who don't tread carefully. So with that, I kind of want to, let's take this back to just general advice. Where are the biggest areas that people trip up in your mind? Like, what are the big kind of common screw ups that people who live across borders or just basically move across borders that they commonly end up seeing the most agony?
It's a fantastic question because it actually goes back to the initial question and the point that I made about enforcement. So the most common issue, I would say, would be to do with tax reporting. So FBARs and FATCA and that kind of thing.
Sorry, just to stop you there, just so anyone's listening who is not aware of this, just to be 100% clear, the U.S., unlike every other country in the world with the exception of Eritrea, I believe, tax is based on citizenship, not residency, which means when you leave Canada or Australia, you file an exit return, I take it, in Australia, and then you're done. And unless you have assets that remain in Australia or Canada, you don't have to file with that tax authority anymore. In the U.S., it doesn't matter if you live on Mars, you're filing with the IRS.
That's right. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be assessed U.S. tax. In fact, rarely in the countries that we look at in the GFP Institute does that actually happen, unless it's U.S. sourced income, which is a different topic, but it is an issue. And so there is, first you have to be assessed and you have to report. So there's informational reporting on accounts held abroad. And then there's also just filing that U.S. tax return so that the U.S. can be sure that they are in fact receiving their fair share. Well, fair should really be in quotes, right? Given what you just said, Jason.
No one likes paying money to a government that they're not actually getting any benefit from necessarily. So it's never pleasant.
So the issues that trip people up are the tax reporting, as I was just mentioning. Another one would be what's called PFICs, passive foreign investment companies. So that is a very protectionist measure that the U.S. has introduced in 1986 Tax Reform Act, where essentially if a U.S. person, and I use that term to refer to U.S. taxpayers, so that could be a citizen, a permanent resident, or even a tax resident of the U.S., so someone there on a visa, if they own an investment vehicle overseas that is deemed to be a PFIC, a passive foreign investment corporation, and there's a couple tests that apply to that, but basically any foreign mutual or managed fund or ETF or REIT, then it's going to be taxed at a very high and punitive rate. And so we see a lot of folks unwittingly stepping into that. But it goes back to what I said before, and that is to do with enforcement. So while these are absolutely on the books and apply to individuals, the fact that the sheriff is kind of asleep at the switch changes things. I like to use the analogy of anyone who's been in Northern California to say the enforcement is a lot like enforcement of the speed limits on Highway 101, where if you're doing the speed of traffic, you're suspicious because no one's doing the speed. Everyone's driving 10 miles over the limit. But the question remains, could you be booked if you're driving 10 miles over the limit? You're driving the speed of traffic. And the answer is absolutely yes, you can. It's just you're going to be really unlucky if that happens. However, as advisors, all we can do is recommend that our clients fully follow the law. And that's, of course, what we recommend. Then we come up against a culture of ignorance, naivety, and non-compliance, where people will say, well, I've never heard of that before. None of my friends do this. So what are you talking about?
Oh God, I get that all the time. So in particular, I will say this: having to deal with, being of Portuguese descent and having handful of clients old school guys who basically go back every year for like 6 months, which already they're offside on residency. None of my friends are reporting this. Well, I don't care what your friends are like. Like if your child said that to you, would you basically take that as an excuse? Like it's not going to happen.
That's what I mean by the speed of doing the speed of traffic. Like, hey, why did you pull me over, officer? I was doing what everyone else was doing. Doesn't make it legal.
Yeah. Exactly. And it's interesting too. So, the policeman may be a little bit asleep, but I have a differing viewpoint on this to some degree, in that's for now, right? Because I mean, if you look at, I was at a Society of Trust and Estate Planners conference a couple of years back where someone posed the question of, do you think we're heading to a global enforcement regime for taxation? And surprisingly, like in a room of like 800 people, I was one of like 10 hands that went up, and I'm like, are you guys not paying attention? And he basically made the case for what would be required in terms of information sharing, in terms of, it's all slowly happening. The only thing that's not happening at this point is one jurisdiction collecting another jurisdiction's tax revenue on their behalf. So there's that. And then, the other points I've heard made is that, the US, with all this stuff that they put together, like they don't even have time to go through all their FBAR forms. Like they just warehouse them at this point. And I've heard of stories of entire warehouses full of paperwork. And my response is, that's nice. Why do you think they're holding on to it? Because in my opinion, it's a matter of time before they throw an artificial intelligence algorithm at it and pop up all the violators.
Yeah, and that's the best answer that we had a fantastic guest speaker last year for our masterclass program who was a tax attorney at Withers, a venerated global tax law firm, amongst other specialties. And that was the answer that she gave. She said, yes, the IRS has been defunded over a period of many years. Yes, there are fewer audits, but she said there doesn't need to be as many audits. These non-compliance notices can be sent automatically. And the IRS is investing very heavily in artificial intelligence, and they know the suspicious transactions that they want to flag.
That's it. And there's a lot fewer people working in farming over the last 100 years too. I mean, it doesn't mean that just because they're funded less and there's fewer people, doesn't mean that they can't automate the heck out of that. And you know what? I guarantee you, there's some Silicon Valley companies figuring out how to apply that technology to tax reporting.
Absolutely. And the IRS would be willing to pay hand over fist for it because, they run a business as much as they're hoping that their revenue exceeds their expenses. And if ever there was an investment that they could make, that has to be it. Hey, we'll spend $100 million on some AI software and we'll get billions of dollars in penalties that we are owed, as per the law.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that precipitated my need to learn more about cross-border was when the U.S. actually started to crack down on, I think it was around 2008, when they started to crack down on non-resident Americans, and they increased the reporting through FACTA and everything else. And so I, very quickly had to educate myself because we discovered that more than 20% of the client base had U.S. tax exposure. So, I got involved in all that, and quickly discovered just, oh my God, there's so much non-compliance out there. And most people have no idea what is going on. It is a ticking time bomb for a lot of these people, quite honestly.
Absolutely. Well, that's the thing, Jason, is I go back to brain function and evolution when I think about the propensity of the average individual to engage in planning. I mean, it's a higher order function that humans have to even think of the future and think about what's coming. And the fact is that most people just simply don't. I mean, they just don't. I don't know what percentage of let's call it 80% of the population just don't engage in planning in the first place. Mm-hmm. So that's a problem. That's saying that our addressable market is immediately reduced by a significant amount. But then secondly, the pain has to be significant enough for someone to pick up the phone or write an email and make an inquiry in the first place. And so I'm actually addressing your former point in a different manner. So where do we get a lot of inquiries from? Where do they originate from? They mostly originate from stranded retirement accounts. So someone's got tens of thousands of dollars. They know they're going to get hosed if they try and distribute it without advice or without doing the right thing. And that's when they pick up the phone. The problem is for practitioners where there's a market failure is I have a boutique firm. There's one of me. I've got a couple staff, but essentially there's one of me. And so if someone's coming along with a very focused, very specific question, I don't have the capacity to take on those kind of clients. So there's a problem. How do those people get advice if there's no one out there offering that specific advice? And it really does need to be specific. As you alluded to with your analogy earlier that I built upon with the Babel fish, every single bilateral or pairwise country combination is going to be different. And that's what's led to me taking a more strident view with other planners I get talking to, where they may be interested in becoming, in their own heads, they're saying, I'll become an international planner and I'll help this amorphous group I hear about called expats. And I'm really coming down on that and saying, it doesn't work. I don't think you can have a profitable business, one that you would actually want or anyone would want to buy, if all you're doing all day long is working with different expats from different places all the time, because you would essentially be a research service if that's what you're doing. You can never.
Well, you're gonna get it wrong. It's beyond cognitive ability. I mean, come on, any one country's tax code is enough of a strain. You throw in a second, third, fourth, just it's brutally painful. I mean, there is something to be said for simplifying one's life when dealing across borders as much as possible. But yeah, if someone's going to tell you that I deal with cross-border in 7 different countries, I would just laugh.
Exactly. And maybe they could. There was a student we had last year who had this vision in his head of moving down to Latin America and dealing with retirees. And I thought, you know what, that I could imagine. I'd say I'm being generous. I could imagine if you said, I know Mexico, Costa Rica, and maybe one other country's retirement issues, and that's tax and retirement, and that's it. And you didn't say, I know everything there's to know about. What if we accrue stock options in one country and go?
Oh God, stock options! You just drop the time bomb every time stock options get involved. It's like, this is going to end poorly because it just never dealt with anywhere in a tax code, in a cross-border treaty, and it's just brutal. Yeah. No, I mean, I can see that if you simplify it down to just retirement accounts, I'm sure you can build a knowledge base. But I live a different world. Canada's the benefactor of the largest number of U.S. expats, so there's enough of a market here to just do that. In fact, I know a handful of people who specifically, and you know them too, who basically specialize in nothing but that, and they do quite well. But it's something that, frankly, not enough advisors know about, and the ones who, and actually, I think just in general, as lax as consumers are about the need or the moving between borders on this stuff, I'd say that the advisory industry is equally as lax, if not worse off, because there's a higher duty of care there. And I still remember sitting in a meeting with an advisory board meeting with other advisors in 2012 and going on about the need for PFIC reporting about something. And one of the advisors was like, when did this happen? I don't know, 6 years ago. And they're like, well, I've never heard of it. This is the first time I've heard of it. I'm like, dude, there's been so many newspaper articles and articles in our own publications. What do you read all day? Right. So it's just, I thought to myself, my God, how offside are so many of his clients now because of this?
Absolutely. And that's the thing is, where to start with this? I could give an hour-long lecture just on that very point you raised. I think the problem is the advisors have an economic incentive to work with whoever they can and fluff their way through it. I get it all the time. Literally woke up today to 2 inquiries. Hey, I've got an Aussie expat. Can I work with you on an hourly basis for you just to inform me about what I need to know so that I can continue working with the client? And it's not that I am opposed to advisors continuing to work with their own clients who happen to be Aussie expats. It's that there's so much to know. And the fact finding, from the very beginning, if you haven't collected information about their immigration patterns and you don't know the visas or when they applied for a green card, you're off to a poor start. So the trouble there is there's an economic incentive advisors have to continue working with clients. There's a lack of enforcement, certainly from a regulatory point of view. In the US, we're cursed with regulations that were written in the aftermath of the Great Depression that are focused singularly on the investment. They don't have anything to do with financial planning at all. And so we're left with this toothless tiger known as the CFP board, who have as standard, A13 is competence, which says you must be competent in the area in which you're practicing to provide that advice. Well, like I said, toothless tiger. Has anyone ever heard of that being enforced? Ever? Ever. And so all of these things, bring it all together. And I think I'm beginning to paint a picture as hazy as my vacation mind is doing here in struggling to string words together. I think you're beginning to see why there is a need for something like a GFP Institute, to provide that education and to make it accessible and to try and lower the barriers to entry for folks trying to
get that. It's funny. The number, I often say, it's what's quite amusing is the number of people who claim to do cross-border financial planning in my country and the very small number of us who actually have CFPs on both sides of the border. It's quite amusing. Lots more people with Series 7's licenses in the US, in Canada, but not a lot of CFP, dual CFPs. So which by the way, anyone listening who's an advisor, there's a fast track if you want to do that. Anyway, email me. So, okay, now that we've scared everyone, specifically consumers. And by the way, this is a podcast primarily for business owners. And I'll tell you right now, if you're dealing with business, if you're a business owner with, cross-border issues, I hope you're really getting the right advice, because my God, there's so many ways to screw that up, even worse than the average individual. Now that we've scared everyone, let's talk about where to find help. So there's no one repository of like a database that basically points to all cross-border situations. If someone is looking for advice on basically multi-jurisdictional planning, what is your advice for what they should look out for and the kind of questions they should ask of that person?
Yeah. Wow. What a great question. And you're going to have to forgive me for being a little self-serving in my answer, but I'm going to try and answer it as impartially as I can. So the way I would do that today would probably be the way I answered the same question from a good university friend of mine who's been incredibly successful. He started a global spirits company, non-alcoholic spirits company that has been incredibly successful. And so he called me up about a year ago and he said, "Gosh, Ash, I need to help. I need some help finding someone who knows about UK, Australia, and the US. Where should I go?" And I said, the way I would do that would be a circuitous search, starting with STEP, going to the Society of Trust and Estate Planners. Now, the trouble you'll have with STEP is inherent right there in the name. You're looking for financial planning advice and you're asking estate planners. However, this is an incredibly international group, probably the most international group of all of the, if you could, financial and legal services groups that I know of. They are going to be connected, because that's their business. They're going to be connected to the lawyers, the tax lawyers, to the private bankers, and to the specialist financial advisors that know those particular cross-border combinations. So that was the answer that I gave him. But the trouble with STEP, Jason, as you would know, is it really veers sort of high net worth. The trust and estate
absolutely.
They only get really excited about these multi-jurisdictional trust structures, when there's tens of millions of dollars involved. And so for the mass affluent, or the folks under, let's say, $10 million in net worth, it's going to be a bit more challenging, because that STEP member, that person whose hourly rate is $800 an hour, they're not so inclined to take a call if there isn't some, forgive the graphic expression, if there isn't some meat on the bone. If they can't see a juicy prospect, then they're going to say, "Hey, I don't have time for this. I'm sorry." So again, another market failure that I identify. So where would you go? You would, there's a couple places. There would be the FPA, the US FPA's International Cross-Border Knowledge Circle. However, there is no centralized repository of who does what, nor their qualifications. So where else could you go? You could go to, I think, look at how someone is incentivized, and you'll understand their conflicts and see how their advice is shaped. So for that reason, I tend to veer towards fee only in the US, maybe call it fee only in Canada, or fee for service or something like that, probably something similar, I'm sure, Jason. But looking at somewhere like XY Planning Network in the US, or NAPFA, those advisors tend to be a bit more principled, and they will really do some shopping around. You'll see, I see on their forums, every week, does anyone know anyone who blah, 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 fill in the blank. But it was identifying this particular shortcoming that we're talking about right now that led to the initiative that we're launching with the GFPI Institute, and that is where there is a find an advisor search tool that would work very similar to how STEP's tool works, where you could say, "I am in this country, I am seeking a professional, with expertise in this other country who has specific knowledge of business owners or retirement plans or whatever the case may be." So we're building that out. In fact, one of our members just asked about that yesterday and said, "What's a timeline for that release?" We're looking at late February for that. But we're also limited by, I don't want to tout that it's any kind of exhaustive database at one time, as our membership is growing. And it's only through bringing cross-border planners together, making sure that they satisfy a minimum standards of expertise, that we're able to say, we're making this, we're not guaranteeing any referral, but we're making it pretty confidently that this person knows what they're talking about, because we've tested them. We know that they have a minimum competence to provide some advice.
Excellent. So good. I mean, they give us some options. I'll also plug the two associations I'm on the board of in this country, the Financial Planning Association of Canada and the Institute for Advanced Financial Planners. There are a handful of cross-border planners there that are credentialed or qualified some of those search functions will help you find them. Otherwise, contacting the group is also valuable. So before we sign off, Ashley, where can people find you and learn more about both cross-border planning and what it is you're trying to accomplish with the association?
Absolutely.
The institute.
GFP.institute. And yes, .institute is a web suffix that's now used.
Yep.
So GFP, Global Financial Planning .institute, and that will talk about the mission of the GFP, the masterclass, and then for private clients, that would be arete, ARETE-WA.com. So that's for Aussies in America or Americans in Australia.
Excellent. Ashley, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you for all that you do, Jason.
My pleasure. So that was today's episode of Financial Planning for Canadian Business Owners. I hope you enjoyed that. And I hope you got the message that, frankly, and we try to beat it into your heads quite frequently on this one, is get help, especially if you're dealing across borders, because the convoluted nature in which that entire domain works is not for the faint of heart. As always, if you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever it is you get your podcasts. Until next time, take care.
This podcast was brought to you by Woodgate Financial, an award-winning financial planning firm catering to high net worth individuals, business owners, and their families. To learn more, go to woodgate.com. You can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify, or find more episodes at jasonpereira.ca. You can even ask Siri, Alexa, or Google Home to subscribe for you.